Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to talk about the history of student activism throughout the United States, where it began to be a common feature found on campuses, the controversies it has stirred, and the effects that it has had. My guest for this is Robert Cohen. Robert Cohen's a professor of history and social studies at New York University. He's the author of a number of books, including Howard Zinn's Southern Diary, Sit-ins, Civil Rights, and Black Women's Student Activism, and Freedom's Orator, Mario Savio, and the Radical Legacy of the 1960s. Robert Cohen, thank you so much for taking this time to join us to talk today.
Yeah, it's great to be here with you.
I mentioned one of your books. You've written a few books, actually, about Howard Zinn. I guess to talk about the history of student activism, it's also important to talk about Howard Zinn and his effect on student activism over the years. And wasn't he a student activist himself?
But the book is about him as a faculty activist, and that's another important issue that many times we focus on youth as if they're in a vacuum, but they're at colleges and universities, they're working classes, and they're influenced by professors. That's not to say that professors create their politics, but they can encourage them and to think critically. And Zinn was a professor, actually chair of the history department at Spelman College, a historically black college in Atlanta, in the 50s to the early 60s, and he had his students involved in. I mean, he encouraged them to challenge racism, segregation, discrimination, and so with the first sit-in, as the sit-in spread from Greensboro, North Carolina, the sit-ins, that's the lunch counter sit-ins against the refusal of these lunch counters to serve African Americans. That started in Greensboro, but then quickly spread. Atlanta has a consortium of historically black colleges. And this women's college, which generally used to be thought of as like, oh, it's almost like a finishing school. It's so much about, kind of traditional gender roles and all that. But the students, below the surface, the students were really concerned about racism and the discrimination. Remember, it says Jim Crow, Georgia. And he encouraged them in their critical thinking. And they did things like initially, even before the sit-ins, he had them they were trying to desegregate the libraries of Atlanta, public libraries, and that succeeded. And then when the sit-ins began, his students were really a part of it. They didn't get the attention that they should have, probably because at that point the media was so sexist. They would focus on the men, but Howard Zinn encouraged them to do that. And the other part of the story that's interesting was they're struggling against racism downtown. But the campus was very paternalistic, had curfews. You had to wear, you couldn't wear pants except on Sunday. There wasn't really free speech on campus, and so so it was a contradiction there. You go downtown, right, to protest against racism, and you come back to campus and you're treated like a little girl. And so there was a contradiction the students felt, and Howard Zinn encouraged them to try to get the student regulations liberalized so they could be treated like they're adults. And they did protest, and that protest got Zinn into trouble because the college president thought that he was behind it. He wasn't. But anyway, eventually, even though he was chair of the department and supposedly had tenure, he was fired for helping them. And that book that I have is his diary that semester, which is really interesting because it reflects not only his perspective, but his students who are, going downtown to protest, being suppressed and so forth. So it's a really interesting story. And of course, later on, his best-selling People's History of the United States encouraged a lot of students to think critically about the history of racial discrimination and classism and all the rest. So I think, a really kind of big impact. He was also, by the way, very involved in the anti-war movement and was a leading speaker about it. And I remember one of the more interesting things, he would testify for students that were arrested for their anti-war activism. And one of my favorite lines for him was like, how do you put it? He said that you said that the students were arrested for disturbing the peace. They were really arrested for disturbing the war, so that, it's like saying that they're trying to do something very humane and important. So he had a real background in this. And he also, by the way, one last thing about Zinn, he didn't want to, with the draft during Vietnam, that you could get a situation where, well, they had a test to get a student exemption, and also your grade point average affected it. And he wrote this thing about how his grades would not be a tool for the war in Vietnam. So he wrote that he explained to students that for the purposes of selective service, he would tell them if the grades were ready, he'd give them a higher grade, right? Like a good grade, and then to an employer or grad school, he'd give the true grade. So in a way, he was involved in that's a kind of form of resistance too. So yeah, he was a big force for that. And again, African American students, just to mention, in the 60s played a really important role in sparking student activism, inspiring what became the New Left, the use of civil disobedience, which the free speech movement at Berkeley, the big innovation there was applying those tactics that have been used to fight racism on lunch counters and stores off campus. Now they're going to be brought on campus to give students the leverage for progressive change.
I suspect many of the students who are living in tents right now on college campuses across the country, probably most of them either have or are quite familiar with Howard Zinn's iconic book, A People's History of the United States.
Right. Yeah, it's a bestseller. It's been selling. It's really a remarkable book because it became a bestseller during the Reagan era. Initially during the 80s, and it sold many copies every year. And I think it has provoked students to think critically about inequality, capitalism, racism, and so forth. So yeah, I think it does. It has had an impact on a lot of students, generations of students, I think.
The importance of black colleges in the history of student movements. This can't be understated.
Right. Yeah. Oh, it's very important. And it's best known from the 1960s, but actually the first black student rebellion was in the 1920s. It was, I mean, this again, most people don't know the history of student activism because it's not taught in schools. It's just not, there's not a focus on it. But the historically black colleges in the 20s were generally headed by white administrators who were very conservative and treated the students like children and also deferred to Jim Crowism, so for example, and actually when eventually the black colleges became one of the first places in the South where you could have integrated meetings. And sometimes that created problems. Like I'll give you one example. There's a former Berkeley law professor named Robert Post. He just wrote an amazing book on William Howard Taft, who was the Chief Justice after becoming president of the United States and a very important figure in American legal history. But I spoke to Post about something he was interested in, that Taft was the head of the board of trustees of the Hampton Institute, a historically black college in Virginia. And the students there, they had this, it was a kind of a risque dance thing that was going on. It had a big crowd, and they had both the people from the campus who were black, and they invited the community. And some whites came, including a white legislator, and they came in late, and much to their horror, because they were racist, they were seated next to an African American couple, and they were like outraged by this. And the husband, who was a legislator, then got the state legislature of Virginia to pass this really restrictive law about you can't have events that have blacks and whites together in them. It was basically total Jim Crowism. You had to separate them. And so it's all about like what the correspondence that Post used is all about what did Taft, as the chair of the board of trustees, how did he respond to this? Because the students were so outraged by the fact that that Hampton responded by basically saying, okay, we're not going to challenge this law anymore. And his advice to them was evade the law. Basically, just don't invite the community to events. So you could have integrated events and you avoid trouble by not inviting not doing it publicly, right? And the students thought that was cowardly and deferring to Jim Crow. And so they struck. And what's interesting, I mean, just this is an aside, is like Taft was a kind of a Republican when the Republican Party was, still a little bit the party of Lincoln. And he was, critical of, he thought the law was ridiculous, but he thought the best way is to resist it, not to resist it, but to evade it. And so he's kind of fairly progressive on that. But when it came to student protests, smash them, expel them. Like, in other words, so what I'm just saying about this incident is kind of revealing that, first of all, that the black students that early on were willing to take a stance and risk their careers and their educational future to say we should not, as part of a historically black institution, be deferring to this racism, right? And then you had the president, I mean, the chair of the board of trustees and the president, who said, you can't strike. And so they'd rather kind of try to evade this law, which might have been smart. I'm not saying it's tactically it might make sense, but they thought it was cowardly. And then so you had this former president, Chief Justice of the United States, who was the chair of the board of trustees. He's telling the college president to take a tough stance on this, even though he doesn't really think, he thinks these Jim Crow laws are wrong and all that. But he's not willing to kind of. It's sort of a little bit like the '60s, how the students who protested racism was like, we want freedom now. Right? That was the kind of immediatism, like an immediate abolitionist now, right? We want freedom now. Whereas, the Taft and historically black colleges were more like, let's just play along and try to evade this if we can. So that's sort of typical of, college students, there's a kind of idealism there that, maybe they're wrong sometimes, but on this stance, I don't think we could say that they're wrong. But that's sort of typical, this kind of tension between, if you think about student politics, you have, first of all, what the idealistic students are trying to do, how the administration, the president, and the trustees respond, and then what is the public like? And I would just say this too, so it's a really important thing to understand. All through American history, no matter what the cause is, no matter what the tactics are, the public does not approve of student movements. Whether you think about the sit-ins, the freedom rides, the freedom of speech movement, the anti-war movement of the 60s, the majorities are always opposed. And so that's kind of strange. Like, think about the free speech movement. Why would anybody oppose the free speech movement, which was trying to merely kind of protect the First Amendment? Or think about the sit-ins. How could anybody object to students trying to insist that these lunch counters stop discriminating on the basis of race? So those seems like noble causes. And by the way, both those movements were nonviolent. In fact, the sit-ins were led by people who were black students who were, dressed like you would get dressed to go to church or to really, really dressed up, looking really respectable. So why is it that there's so much a public disapproval? And I'm sure with the movement today, the same thing. There's going to be a public disapproval. And why is that? And by the way, even with the anti-war movement of the 60s, even as the country came out against the war, increasingly, because the war wasn't working, that we were bogged down in the quagmire in Vietnam, even as they got more critical of the war by the Tet Offensive in January 68, they didn't like the war, but they didn't like the anti-war movement more than the war. So why is that? It's complicated, but a few things I'll mention. One is the country is kind of culturally conservative in a lot of ways, a big part of the country. And by that, I mean how they think about students, a little bit like how they think about athletes taking a stand. Like, LeBron James takes a stance against some issue of racism, say police brutality or something. They'll say, shut up and play. And with students, it's shut up and study. So basically the idea is that students should be sort of seen and not heard. They should respect their elders, obey the regulations. And if they're protesting, they get out of their lane. The idea, well, politics is really about, electoral politics and whether you vote. And so this is not really appropriate to have demonstrations. And so you often get the student movements caricatured in a hostile way by the public. Like just 2 days ago, in the Washington Post, they had a cartoon by, this very famous conservative cartoonist. He's very talented. His name is Ramirez. His last name is Ramirez. And he had, it was a sketch of a likeness of the president of Columbia University. And she's on a podium speaking and saying, what are we going to do about these violent student protests? And basically acting like it's real complicated. And the cartoonist then has a little girl tugging her skirt and saying, arrest them, right? And here's the thing. This is before the occupation when they took over the building. It was when they're peacefully, nonviolently out and camped on the grass outside, right? Not violating any laws. And the movement was not violent. But the first thing he's saying is, what do we do about these violent student protests? And so that really reminds me very strongly of the free speech movement, which was a nonviolent movement influenced by the nonviolent tactics of the civil rights sit-ins. And yet, how was it depicted in a lot of the media? The Berkeley riots. And so Ronald Reagan, when he ran for governor in 66, pledged to clean up the mess in Berkeley. And, that helped him win a landslide victory over Edmund Brown. So I'm saying there is this, real hostility to student protest. And sometimes it really has tragic consequences. Like Nixon, Trump really resembles Nixon in a lot of ways. Nixon was sort of demonizing the student protesters. And so after Cambodia, he talks when the students were really upset about that Nixon came into office, you remember saying, we're going to end the war. I have a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam. And then he expands the war to Cambodia. So the students are furious. And there's a lot of protests all across the country. And students call them bums. They're burning up the campuses, right? And a few days later, this National Guard is sent in by Nixon sort of clone, the governor of Ohio, James Rhodes. And they basically say, no, you can't have any meetings on campus. And so they send in the troops and 4 students get killed and 9 get wounded there. So sometimes this protest, this hostility can not just be repressive, but deadly. And then afterwards, like the aftermath, you hear on the radio, especially in that county, Portage County, Ohio, where Kentucky, where Kent State is, they should have shot more, or some of the police later said, National Guard 4, Kent State 0, like as an athletic thing. Or there's one of the students who was paralyzed from being shot. He wasn't killed, but he woke up from surgery and he got this card. It looked like a get well card, and it said, I'm sorry you survived, you commie bastard. And so think about that, right? That kind of inhumanity and the political intolerance. There's always been an undercurrent of that. Or Reagan very famously, after Wheeler Auditorium was burned, we don't know why at the Berkeley campus. I mean, don't know who or why it was burned, but it was during the Third World Strike, where Black students and other students of color were striking. And he speaks to a farmers gathering in Northern California. And he says, he's talking about the student protest movement. He says, if it takes a bloodbath, let's get it over with. No more appeasement. Or there's another example of Reagan where, because of People's Park, one person, James Rector, was killed, another was blinded, and about 50 were shot, wounded. And one of his critics at a press conference, I think, was saying to Reagan, if you keep using a force like this, you're going to have blood on your hands. And Reagan joked, "That's all right. I'll wash it off with Baraxo." Baraxo was the soap that he advertised when he was doing the sort of Western show when he was a TV host. So you just think about that kind of thing. Or Trump the other night when the arrests were made at Columbia, saying, it was a beautiful thing when you had the police invaded by the camp. And whether you thought the police should be brought in or not, that's not the issue. It's just really being happy about it or excited about the suppression of dissent. So that's a kind of, in other words, in a way you could say that the way people respond to student movements is a kind of it's like a barometer of how much tolerance there is for dissent in America. So, and I think we're not in great shape on that score right now. Go ahead.
Well, there is a long history of school administrators calling in the police to bring an end to activism on the campus. I suppose that this action would also just spur the movement further.
That was what happened at Columbia initially. I mean, there's different phases of it, but let's go back to the beginning of the protests at Columbia. First of all, you have to think about a larger political context. Earlier this academic year, the president of Harvard and Penn, University of Pennsylvania, basically lost their jobs because in congressional testimony, before these right-wing dominated congressional committee, Elise Stefanik and others, they were asked about, how are you going to respond to anti-Semitism and to this movement, which they're equating with the anti-Gaza war movement, they're equating with anti-Semitism, and they kind of botched it to some degree. They were trying to make the distinction between protected speech under the First Amendment and freedom of speech, and then harassment. They didn't do a good job, so it made it sound like they weren't opposed to anti-Semitism. That's how it was twisted to make it sound they didn't do a good job. And that then opened the door to her being pressured by rich donors and people in Congress. Stefanik was trying to get her fired. In fact, after she and the Penn president were fired, then the president of she wanted to get the president of MIT to step down too, which didn't happen. So she said 2 down, 1 to go. So there's this pressure, and here's the point: colleges and universities is like a pecking order. At the top or near the top is always Harvard and some of the Ivy League schools. Berkeley's up there too. But if the president of Harvard can get fired for not suppressing a dissident movement like this, what message is that sending to the other college administrators? So the new president of Columbia really got that message. So when she went to the Congress to give similar testimony, she was more, hard line, like we're not going to tolerate this stuff. And then she goes back to the campus. The next day, they arrest over 100 students. Now, here's the thing about it, right? At that point, the students weren't, and this is the distinction that's really important to make, that yes, there have been police sent in. Usually they are sent in when the protests are either disruptive, they're violating they're violating time, place, and manner regulations. Time, place, and manner is like the settlement of the free speech movement here kind of helped to set this as a national kind of tradition, which is the best places don't regulate the content of speech on campus, right? You can say whatever you want, but subject to time, place, and manner. That's like at Berkeley, you can give a speech, any speech you want on Sproul Plaza, but not in somebody's math class. You can't disrupt the educational system, the education that's in the function of the university. So what happens, generally speaking, in most times and places, it's something that's disruptive that brings in the police, right? In other words, you're blockading a building, like what happened at Columbia later, where they took over Hamilton Hall. That is the kind of thing that you'd always get the police coming for. What's unusual about what happened earlier was the president of Columbia, and also the president of my university, New York University, and also the governor of the University of Texas, sent in the police to break up demonstrations that were not disruptive of the normal functioning of the university. I mean, you could say technically they are, because they may some students may not want to pass by that encampment, but it's a kind of a stretch. And it's not the same thing as you can't get to your classroom, or we're blockading it, or we're locking the building. That's major disruption. This is very, very minor violation of time, place, and manner regulations, which you ordinarily, like if that had occurred, say in May 1970, when the campuses were all aflame after the Cambodian invasion in Kent State, you would have been delighted as a college president. You had such a moderate protest, right? But the country, because of this public pressure, has sort of moved so far to the right on these things towards repression that they send in the police to evict these protesters at Columbia, here at NYU, and at the University of Texas. So you're right that there is a tradition of bringing in police that suppress protests, but not with so little pretext. And so to me, like in other words, and remember, even after she did that, that is after the president of Columbia had that initial arrest, which by the way backfires, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Then still the Speaker of the House of Representatives and a whole congressional delegation comes to her campus to say that she should resign because she hasn't been tough enough. And by the way, that's not totally unprecedented because, Ronald Reagan did that to Clark Kerr, the president of the University of California, and to the governor who's running against Edmund Brown. He acted like they were too soft on the protesters, even though eventually in December of '64, they sent in a police invasion. There was the largest mass arrest in California history of the free speech movement. People, almost 800 people arrested. But that wasn't tough enough because they didn't do the arrests at the beginning of the movement in October when the students did that nonviolent blockade around the police car. But still, this is all happening much more quickly, right? In other words, she sends in she goes to Congress, the president of Columbia, gives that testimony. I'm going to be tough. The next day, they do these mass arrests. And even with that, even though she's deferred to the right wing and done all that, they still come out to the Congress. I'm talking about the Speaker of the House and the congressional delegation. They still come to Columbia and to urge that she has to resign. I mean, what is she, like a tank commander that she can just mow down all the protest? I mean, what do they think a president can do? Even if they want to be repressive, the students are going to come out anyway. So it's like you're not doing your job as a college president in their view, unless you totally, outlawed dissent of this type. So that's really, and what did it do? Eventually it ended up, after the eviction of the protest and the arrest, a lot of students who may not agree with the protest about Israel and Palestine were outraged that their friends and classmates were arrested for sitting out on the lawn, right? So in symbolic protest. So that they had more students come out, and there was a lot of anger. There was kind of dialectic of protest and repression. And some of the students, and I guess some non-students too, then escalated, and I think unwisely, took over Hamilton Hall, right? So I'm saying, like in a way, they're not really they're just this pressure to suppress protest. Sometimes it works, but usually it backfires because more students are upset about the thing. And one other thing I should mention to you is that why do we have this dynamic of students protesting in the way they do, like demonstrating or having encampments and things like that? Why are they always doing that? And what often doing? It's not always, but why does that often happen? And the reason why is because universities are fundamentally undemocratic. That is, like, if you don't like Joe Biden, you don't have to have a big demonstration. I mean, you can, but you can just vote him out of office on election day. If you don't like the investment policy of a university and you're a student, well, that's too bad. You don't have a vote. In fact, most campuses, like mine, students don't even have a sort of token representative on the board of trustees. So you're disenfranchised. So in a certain sense, it's like the only way you can express yourself is through demonstrations. And so I guess what I'm saying is that a lot of this sort of this friction comes down to the fact that universities are fundamentally undemocratic and not very responsive to student opinion. And one last thing I'll say, it's kind of comical. There's a book, I don't know if you've heard of it, and a movie too, about the Columbia Rebellion of 1968. It's called The Strawberry Statement by this guy named Cohen. You ever heard of this book? It's very interesting. But the title comes from something that's very revealing and it's worth remembering. And that is the strawberry statement. What's the strawberry statement? Well, the author of this book, who was a student sympathetic to the protests in Columbia '68, which was against the war in Vietnam and against racism, he asked the dean. So what happens is the issues of Columbia, I won't go into detail about them, but they have concerned the university's role with defense research for the war and also opposition to, well, the other piece was about universities' sort of callous disregard for the surrounding Black community in Harlem. Okay, there's more details, but just that gets at it. And the students took a poll. They took a vote, like a vote on it, on these two issues that he wanted to have the university to kind of stop its mistreatment of the Black community and stop its complicity with the war, in their view. So he tells the dean about these, and the dean says, well, that doesn't matter to him because the university is not a democracy. And in fact, if it becomes a democracy, I'm out of here, right? And he said, what students think about an issue is about as significant to me as you telling me whether or not they like strawberries. And then Kunin jokes, well, I like strawberries. But I mean, the point is, just think about that. Even if you believe that, the arrogance of saying that, and of course, it's because, look, the administrators and faculty, we have PhDs, you're here, you don't have that, and you're here to listen and absorb our wisdom, not to share in governance. But I'm saying that attitude, and it was more explicit because he was mocking it in that kind of comical way, the strawberry statement, that's one of the kind of the underlying problem here. In the 60s, they had this expression, the issue is not the issue, which means that what you see on the surface, not that it doesn't matter, the Israel-Palestine thing, but the substructure of it is that the university is so undemocratic that there's no mechanism by which student opinion on most campuses can be expressed. And I guess you can see that, like contrast Columbia with, say, Brown University. I don't know if you heard about their response to the protests, but they had said, and they were able to kind of like have the protest end by negotiation and saying, we will allow you to present your demands about the university divesting its ties to companies that supply the military in Israel. We will give you bring your best evidence to a meeting of our corporation, like our trustees or the Regents of California, and we'll give it a fair hearing and then we'll vote on it. So that's such a revolutionary idea to actually listen to the students and have them have a chance to talk to the trustees or whatever. That doesn't happen very much on most campuses. So especially in private universities. So there's I think there's a dysfunctionality. And for me, when I just look back at Columbia '68, when you look at that campus, right, they had it was the biggest, after the free speech movement, the biggest protest in the '60s on the campus, right? They had 5 buildings taken over, right? Occupying 5, one by the Black students, the other one by the graduate students, the other by mostly undergrad SDSers. But if that happens, right, if the students are so like in opposition to the administration of the campus, that they take over 5 buildings, that's probably not a very well-run university to begin with. And Columbia, that's a safe assumption, was terribly run at that point. They didn't even have a faculty senate. In fact, the faculty senate at Columbia grew out of the Columbia Rebellion of '68. We better have it, we better figure out a better way to govern ourselves. So I'm just saying, I hope, and it's maybe hope against hope, that these sort of sad events where students are being arrested and like there's some people being hurt, that it would cause some kind of introspection. How can we do better? How can students feel more included? How can we have a better relationship so they don't have to, sleep outside for a week or whatever, and then have all this outrage? Is there some way to have a more inclusive and democratic university? And that's really a question that's not being asked much, but I think it's something that, in other words, there's a big flaw in many of our colleges and universities.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation about the history of student movements in the United States. Our guest is Robert Cohen, professor of history and social studies at New York University. I'd like to go back to the role that Congress has played, and maybe historically, has this happened before? Clearly, it's easy almost to forget, but it was not that long ago that we had these congressional hearings in Congress, in which college leaders had to come in and testify about their handling of demonstrations concerning Palestine and Israel and what's happening in Gaza. Is this Is it unprecedented for Congress to play a role in student activism like this?
No, but I should say it's not. Nor is it. I would also include the president in that. But so let me tell you about Congress. Um, Going back, I mean, the first mass student in American history was a student movement in the 1930s that was like anti-war, anti-fascist, and trying to get federal aid to students so they didn't have to drop out of college because of the Great Depression. The leaders of that student movement got called in by the House Un-American Activities Committee to try to make it look like all the students were communists. Now, there were communists in the leadership of that movement, but it was really kind of a red baiting movement. And by the way, the interesting thing about that is that it was through those hearings that Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the first lady at that time, developed friendships with the students because she went to one of the hearings and invited the students to the White House and had an interesting relationship with some of the leaders like Joseph Lash, who later on became her biographer, won a Pulitzer Prize for that. But I would just say that, and by the way, it's not just at the college level. All throughout the 30s, because there was a lot of mass movements, the CIO, this Communist Party, a lot of mass protest was going on. There were loyalty oaths imposed on school teachers across the country because the idea was the Hearst Press was like Fox News is today. It was this newspaper chain, very right wing, and they believed that, oh, it's these subversive teachers who are responsible and also subversive professors. Now, that's a real simplification anyway. You know, students often either they got some progressive politics from their families or from their friends, and there were some radical professors and teachers, but a very small minority. They could have an impact, but, you know, it's a vast exaggeration. I mean, thinking, oh, college students are not becoming radical because of the Depression or because of the rise of Hitler and fascism. No, they're becoming radical because some evil professor, usually with a beard and, you know, slovenly, that they're, you know, from their perspective, they're the ones who are poisoning the minds of the young people. And it's such an oversimplification. So I'm saying there's a long tradition of this. And in the 60s, your question about college administrators also is really right, hitting an important point. In the 60s, the Senate and House committees investigated because they thought the anti-war movement was either communist or led by communist dupes. Because look, the movement was kind of aligned with communists in Vietnam who wanted the war to stop. So, but just because you're opposed to the killing doesn't mean that you're a communist, right? And so they had these hearings and trying to document communist influence in the student movement. And by the way, there was a secret study by the CIA under President Johnson that did the same thing. And the study found, and it's been published now because it was declassified and released under the Freedom of Information Act. The study showed that there wasn't communist leadership dominating the anti-war movement, and the students weren't dupes. And Johnson didn't want to release it. He didn't release the study because he had been red baiting the movement. So there is this tradition, but there's actually a kind of comical piece to this too. I'll mention to you. It's really a bizarre story. But Richard Nixon, you know, was kind of a bizarre character. He hated the student movement. And he had this thing where it's on his tapes, actually. And there's a historian named Mike Konkowitz who's written about this really interesting story with Nixon. Nixon so hated the student anti-war movement that, in a way, he was aligned. This is hard to believe, but it's true. He's kind of aligned with the anti-war movement inadvertently. And let me explain to you what happened. He so hated the anti-war movement, the student anti-war movement, he wanted to break up all the contracts, the defense contracts that MIT, in the Massachusetts Technology, which a lot of defense work, he wanted to break all those contracts and stop them from having military contracts with the Pentagon. Now think of how irrational that is, because the student movement is anti-war. The people doing defense work, they're not going to be anti-war, right? They're helping with the defense establishment, right? Yet he wanted to get rid of the contracts with them. So it's interesting. Because what I say, it was aligned with the movement inadvertently. The New Left, the anti-war movement, wanted to stop research for the war also, right? But for different reasons, right? You know, they wanted to stop it because they're opposed to the war. Nixon wanted to stop it because he was so angry at the anti-war movement. And there's a very funny, I mean, maybe it's not, it seems funny in retrospect, but it's very revealing, I'd say. One of the tapes that, you know, when Nixon recorded all of his conversations, many conversations at the White House through the taping system. But there's this really interesting exchange, which I can send you, of Nixon talking to Kissinger. And Kissinger I think it was during the the big upsurge of protest during the Cambodia invasion, which was the biggest, May 70 was the biggest mobilization of students against the war, against anything in American history on campuses. And so Kissinger, he'd been a Harvard professor before he became Nixon's national security advisor and Secretary of State. He had the Ivy League presidents to the White House to talk to them about the protest, right? And Nixon finds out about this, says, don't ever bring those SOBs to campus again. I don't ever want one of them on the college campus at the White House again. And he starts talking and railing against them. And Nixon, of course, Kissinger, of course, is very apologetic and say how bad they are, because what they felt was, and similar to what happened last week with the Columbia president, they're too permissive. They are coddling these subversive students. It's a little bit like the idea of bashing liberals for crime. The liberals are too permissive, right? And so essentially Nixon wanted to, and he says on the tape, I'm never going to hire a Harvard graduate again. In other words, like, we want to have people who are outside of that elite, who are not going to be critical of the war or of me. So just think about that. The president of the United States railing against these college presidents. And by the way, Reagan did the same thing. This is kind of something brilliant about Ronald Reagan. He got into the governorship in part by bashing Berkeley and by rebuking the Democratic governor, Brown, for not being able to stifle that movement, right? That's on one campus, right? When he was governor from 1966 to the end of the 60s, Berkeley was no longer the one campus in rebellion. There have been rebellions all over the state of California. So think about it. He got elected because he's bashing Governor Brown for not being able to suppress the movement. So how is he going to play this politically? Because everything's gotten worse. The San Francisco State, there's like a semester-long strike. There's just explosions of protests all over the place. Well, what Reagan did was he made it like, oh, that's not the governor's fault. That's the fault of these professors who are encouraging the students to disobey the law, and these college presidents who are too permissive. So essentially, he's shifting the responsibility for it and still demagoguing on it. Like, in other words, he loved baiting the student movement, right? Again, if it takes a bloodbath, let's get it over with, right? But he's not taking responsibility. Now it's because the liberal professors and the college presidents are too permissive. They're coddling these miscreants, So it's a very, whatever you think about it. And Brown wrote about, he has a book after he got defeated by Reagan. He wrote a book called Reagan and Reality. And he has a chapter on the student movement and Reagan's response to it. And it's very revealing. And it also shows that Reagan, in his own way, right, was very clever, but obviously did not really believe in free speech because he wanted to suppress dissident political expression.
A demand that students have today is for their universities to divest from Israel. That's a whole conversation in of itself. But there are, and this isn't the first time I thought this, but there really, since we've seen this movement spark for Palestine after October 7th. I mean, it was always there before, but took on a new proportion in the last 6 months. It always reminded me of the global South African anti-apartheid movement. Do you see parallels there?
Oh, yeah, the divestment demand is very similar, but I think it's much more problematic in this case because, during that movement, which is in the mid-1980s at Berkeley and elsewhere across the country, that also began at Columbia. There was a lot of support for that movement, and also, what was the argument against it? There was almost nobody in the United States who was saying, hey, the apartheid regime in South Africa is great. Let's keep supporting it. That's not what the trustees said when they initially refused to divest. What they said was, it's our fiduciary responsibility to maximize the profits for our endowment. And that's not a very strong argument, right? Because, the idea is that you have some moral responsibility, right? Like sort of like somebody owns a lunch counter says, well, I'm going to lose my white customer if I serve African Americans. That's, that's a kind of that's the same argument. And it's like, well, wait a second. We want to have a society where there isn't racial discrimination. So you're going to have to take that risk. That's just too bad. And so eventually, a lot of these administrators had to back down, including California, in part because Duke Majan was running for re-election against Mayor Bradley of Los Angeles and didn't want to look like he was supporting apartheid. So he got his people on the Board of Regents to reverse. And so the movement won. And that happened on other campuses and cities. But what's different about this movement is that, or this attempt is that, which has been going on since the 90s, is that there's a lot of support for Israel in the country, and over 30 states have laws that if a company is divested in that way, it can't do state business with state agencies. So that makes it much more difficult. And also, as we saw at UCLA with the clash between Zionist and anti-Zionist students, there is a strong Zionist constituency. So I think that particular demand is going to have a hard time gaining traction. And I think in terms of what the movement will achieve, I want to say that success for a movement is often not understood. Like, for example, take the Occupy Wall Street movement, right? It was so anarchistic, it didn't have demands. So you can say, oh, that was a silly movement. It didn't do anything. But it did do something. That is, it changed the conversation about economic inequality in America. And because of that, like you could say, if you Google it, you'll see before Occupy Wall Street, it was discussed a little bit. After Occupy Wall Street, it was discussed a great deal. So I think this movement, I don't think it's going to succeed in these divestment demands in most places, but I think it still is there's several things. One is it is raising questions about the U.S. use of its military aid to support a war that is killing lots of civilians, and it's bringing the attention of the war to the American people, but which is an important thing. And then so that it may affect the presidential election. I think in a way it, plus what happened with the Arab adults in Michigan, already has affected Biden. So, because he's afraid of losing the youth vote, especially in the battleground states. And so I think it's going to have an impact in that way. But it's different than the divestment movement, which did, by the way, affect the political system in the sense that the first time Reagan had something overridden by Congress was on sanctions of South Africa, that he was against it and Congress overrode him. So that movement had an impact on divestment, that demand, and the overall South Africa policy. Whereas this movement, I don't see it really winning on the divestment issue, but it will affect people's perspective on the war itself, which is significant. And let me just say this too, in terms of the function of higher education, is to raise questions, and sometimes uncomfortable questions. And so I think that you have people are not comfortable with that, and so that's not very popular. But if you suppress that, if you get rid of that by suppressing free speech or academic freedom, who's going to be around to ask those tough questions? And so to me, college presidents have a responsibility, even if they don't like the movement or agree with it, to say they should have the freedom to express it. The students have expression to dissent because it's part of what the university should do. And I just want to say on the whole issue about, basically presenting the whole movement as anti-Semitic, is that, there have been anti-Semitic incidents, and those need to be taken seriously. And if people commit anti-Semitic acts, they should be held accountable through due process and complaints. But I think you have to really be factual and use empirical evidence. Like one of the justifications for the arrest here at NYU was it was like not obeying the regulations, and there were anti-Semitic incidents. And I was at that protest for an hour or so just to talk to my students there, some of whom were Jewish. And the leaflet that they gave out was recruiting non-Zionist Jews. And but I didn't hear anything from people that I talked to about it. And none of the signs were anti-Semitic. So I think that and yet that was used as a rationale for a mass arrest, calling in several hundred police to arrest these students. And by the way, that side now, they've been out there a week. There's no sign of evidence. But the arrest came only a few minutes after the Jewish students convened a Passover Seder this is outside of the business school in their encampment. So, I know that there have been anti-Semitic incidents, and those are very serious, and we, should not romanticize the movement, because if you're anti-Zionist, you can distinguish from anti-Semitism, but sometimes there are people who are both, so it does happen, and we should be critical of that. And so I think but the idea that you're going to smear an entire movement is really problematic. And that's, again, if this was, let's just say this was a movement in support of Israel, in support of a popular policy, do we think it would be that these encampments would be evicted this way? I don't think so. It's not, the test of free speech is not how popular speech gets heard, or if it gets heard, it's whether unpopular ideas can get heard, right? And so That's really what's problematic. And what bothers me is, and, the statement by Tom Cotton, that's our senator from Arkansas, that if protesters against the war in Gaza block traffic on a bridge, you should take the law into your own hand and throw the protesters off the bridge. Now think about that. That's basically saying that if you block traffic for this cause, and again, I'm not in support of blocking traffic because there's a lot of problems. People might need to get to the hospital. I don't think that's a good tactic. But the death sentence, you should be like basically thrown off a bridge by a mob. I mean, that's authoritarian. And I think so is arresting people on campuses when they are doing things that are not violent and not disruptive. So in a way, if you take the temperature of this country in sort of post-Trump America, it's not a very pretty picture, and the temperature is not normal. It's really kind of veering towards authoritarianism. And so and that's not to say that the student movements do nothing wrong, or there's no problems with what they do. I think what they did in taking over Hamilton Hall was very foolish, and those images will be used to reinforce what people like Ramirez in that political cartoon I mentioned earlier are saying. Oh, these students, they're just out to rebel. They just want to make trouble. They're breaking things. They're disrespectful. They're violent. So a movement has to be very careful about how it's being seen. And sometimes, especially young students, you get what's called expressive politics, performative politics. Like, I'm going to do something like this, whether or not what effect it has on other people. So that's a real problem. And it's understandable. They're thinking about their small group, their demonstration, their friends. They're not thinking about how does this look to the country. But if you want to change policy for the whole country on something like this, you need to think about how this is going to affect the whole country. And that's why, the Arab adults in Michigan, when they were voting about this with regard to Biden, that's what they were thinking about. How can we leverage the president of the United States to make change? That's different than a political act that makes me feel good, no matter how it actually affects other people. So I think that's problematic as well. One last point I'd make is
these are young people, though, right? I mean, we should always be mindful of that. We were all there at one point and made our own errors.
Right, I agree. I think that that's why. I mean, like, this is another thing that people don't think about, that political demonstrations are part of the learning process. Like at Berkeley, like, why did the students get so upset when they closed the free speech movement area on, right off campus on Bancroft and Telegraph? Why did they get so upset? In part because of the issue of free speech itself, but in part, when you look at what the students say, that students, particularly when they came from high schools that didn't have free speech, they really liked having tables all the way from Goldwater Republicans to the Young Socialist Alliance, Deep South civil rights organizers. They learned a lot from doing it, right? They learned what was going on in the world that may not have been covered in their classes. And so what I'm saying is, even if you don't agree with what the students are saying, there is a lot of learning that's going on. And that's what, an educational institution should be about. That doesn't mean that we should be uncritical. Like, in other words, yes, they're young, but if you are around people who are in those protests, you can say, well, go there, don't go there. That will be a mistake. They may not listen, right? But I think the point is, we want to be mindful of I think, as my role as somebody who is older and has been involved in movements, to say this works and this doesn't work, so you should give this some thought. But I agree with you. They're younger, so that should be like what you're saying is be mindful of that, and that should make you more understanding. But the way that the larger political culture operates is the opposite of that. It's they're young, and therefore they don't know what they're doing, and they should be suppressed because what they're doing is evil. That's a different. What you're saying is really a minority perspective, because you're trying to be empathetic and understanding, whereas the majority is like just generally hostile to ideas that they don't like. And by the way, being for free speech is kind of counterintuitive. What I mean is, if you say something I don't like, I really don't like, it's like, well, shut up. That's the natural response. So you have to have this principled perspective, kind of universalism, and say, wait a second. If I say that to you when you say something that I don't like and try to get you repressed, you could do the same thing to me. And what will be the principle? What's my defense? I've just done the same thing. So this is really problematic, especially when applied to college campuses. And the last point I wanted to make to you is that
we have about 30 seconds. Just
okay. That the movement, like outside, there's 200 students about, right? We have 30,000 students at NYU. So this is kind of like maybe a prophetic minority. So you shouldn't panic that everybody on campuses are revolutionaries. The number one major in the United States since the 60s has been business. So don't fall into this caricature that we have an army of woke revolutionaries on college campuses. Try to gather some empirical data on how people actually think, and don't be part of this, hysterical overreaction when students actually protest, because it's better to have students engaged in caring about society than have the peace of the graveyard where everybody's indifferent.
Robert Cohen has been our guest. He has joined us for a conversation about the history of student activism. Robert Cohen is a professor of history and social studies at New York University. Robert Cohen, I thank you very much for taking this time.
Okay, pleasure to be here.